I'm glad you've joined me tonight, or this afternoon, or very early morning depending on where in the world you're tuning in from. If you feel like sharing, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Whether you're curled up in bed, winding down after a long day, or just letting your mind drift into quieter places, you're in the right spot. Tonight, we're going to take a slow, peaceful journey into the quiet heart of the forest. But don't be fooled by the stillness. Beneath the bark and soil, the trees are whispering. They're sending signals through networks older than any human city, nourishing one another, warning of danger, and raising their young in leafy little communities. Yes, trees have social lives. And tonight, we're going to eavesdrop. Very politely, of course. Before we sink into the roots and reach up into the canopy together, I'll gently ask, if you enjoy these calm, curious wanderings, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing if you haven't already. It helps more than you might think, and it lets me keep making videos like this for the lovely, curious minds like yours. Now, I'll try not to make this too fascinating. After all, the goal is to help you relax. But if it turns out to be just a little too interesting to fall asleep to, well, at least you'll drift off knowing a thing or two about how a tree sends a message, or why a mushroom might be the forest's best postal service. So take a deep breath, settle in, let's begin. Imagine walking through a quiet forest. The sun filters through the canopy in golden ribbons, the air smells of damp earth and pine needles, and somewhere off in the distance a bird chirps with the lazy confidence of someone who knows they own the place. It's peaceful, still even. But beneath your feet, hidden in the soil and the root systems, a whole other world is quietly humming with life. And I mean really humming. You might picture a forest as a collection of individual trees, each one doing its own thing, growing branches, dropping leaves, hoping a squirrel doesn't set up camp in the worst possible place. But in reality, forests function less like isolated individuals and more like communities, neighborhoods, networks. And the most surprising part? Most of that community life is happening underground, out of sight, and at a pace so slow that we humans, with our coffee-fueled urgency, barely notice it. Let's start with the roots, quite literally. Trees, as it turns out, are not loners. Their roots often grow toward each other, even fusing in some cases. This isn't just accidental entanglement. Trees are forming this connection sometimes with each other, sometimes with the help of something even more extraordinary, fungi. Now, I know fungus doesn't sound particularly glamorous. It's the kind of word that conjures up images of leftovers gone wrong or mysterious bathroom corners. But in the forest, fungi are the unsung heroes. They're not just decomposers and rotters, they're also builders and messengers. Enter the mycorrhizal fungi. That's a mouthful, but it breaks down nicely. Myco means fungus, and rhiza means root. These fungi form intricate networks that wrap around or even enter the roots of trees, creating a vast interconnected system scientists often refer to, affectionately and quite accurately, as the Wood Wide Web. Unlike your home Wi-Fi, this network doesn't drop out when it rains, and it doesn't buffer videos. But it does transmit something just as impressive: life-giving nutrients, chemical messages, and even electrical signals. Through this fungal freeway, trees can share water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sugars with one another. A tree thriving in a sunny spot might send extra carbon-rich sugars to a shaded sibling. Another might pass along warning chemicals if it's under attack by pests, giving others time to beef up their own defenses. These fungal threads, called hyphae, are incredibly tiny. We're talking thinner than a human hair, but knit together, they form massive underground networks stretching for miles. One study in Oregon found a single fungal organism spanning nearly 4 square miles. That's one fungus. It's been nicknamed the humongous fungus because yet scientists, while brilliant, still enjoy a good pun. The symbiosis here is a classic win-win. The trees feed the fungi sugars they've made through photosynthesis, and in return, the fungi help trees gather minerals and water that would otherwise be out of reach. There are like little underground delivery services, but instead of charging a subscription fee, they just ask for a share of the photosynthetic pie. Even more intriguing is the way these networks don't just form between trees of the same species. A birch might connect to a fir, a pine to a maple. This cross-species communication allows for a sort of quiet diplomacy between different members of the forest. They may not all like the same soil pH or have the same opinion about autumn, but they still share resources and information. That's collaboration. What's even more poetic is that some trees seem to act as central hubs. older, more established individuals with large root systems and rich fungal connections. These trees send nutrients to saplings, especially their own offspring, helping them survive in the dim understory where sunlight is scarce. Scientists sometimes refer to them as mother trees, and while that might sound a bit anthropomorphic, the data backs it up. These trees can recognize their kin and show a distinct preference for supporting them. All of this challenges the old-school view of nature as a ruthless, every plant for itself battleground. Yes, competition exists, trees still jostle for light and water, but cooperation plays a massive role in keeping forests healthy and resilient. The fungal network helps maintain that balance, a quiet regulator ensuring that the system doesn't collapse into chaos. And what about the fungi themselves? They're not just passive couriers. Some species are choosy, forming exclusive relationships with particular trees. Others are more laid back, partnering with whoever's roots happen to wander by. They can even prioritize who gets what based on the health and generosity of their tree partners. In essence, fungi manage a dynamic economy of nutrients, with supply chains, budgets, and maybe even a little bit of favoritism. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how long this partnership has existed. Fossil evidence shows that plants and fungi have been co-evolving for over 400 million years. Long before flowers, fruits, or even trees as we know them existed, fungi were already making deals with ancient plants to share nutrients. It's one of the oldest alliances in the natural world, and it's still going strong beneath our feet every day. And yet, most of us walk through forests without realizing any of this is happening. We admire the towering trunks, the rustling leaves, maybe take a photo of a squirrel doing something photogenic. But the real drama, the real complexity, is hidden in the soil, under our shoes and paws and roots. So next time you find yourself in a forest, pause for a moment. Imagine the vast, invisible web stretching below you. A web built not from silk but from cells and carbon and cooperation. A living network older than civilization, still whispering its messages in the dark, cool soil. Quiet, constant, connected. And who knows? Somewhere down there a tree might be passing along a message. Maybe it's just a friendly hello. Or maybe it's a gentle reminder. In the forest, nobody truly stands alone. Let's linger a little longer in the quiet shadows of the forest, where something remarkable is happening, though you'd never notice it with your eyes alone. There's no sound, no flashing lights, no waving branches or Morse code bark tapping. And yet, right this very moment, messages are zipping through the soil at a glacial pace, slower than any Wi-Fi you've ever known, but astonishingly effective. This is the Wood Wide Web. Yes, that's the real term scientists use, coined with a smile by Dr. Suzanne Simard, a forest ecologist from British Columbia. It refers to the vast network of fungal threads connecting trees in a forest like so many biological Ethernet cables. It's part science, part poetry, and entirely fascinating. You might expect forests to be silent places, solitary trees growing in isolation, each one just hoping for enough sunlight and rain to get through another season. But Dr. Simard's research changed that view forever. She was one of the first to demonstrate that trees are not only connected underground by mycorrhizal fungi, but that they actually use these connections to communicate, share resources, and even look after one another. Picture a dense forest for a moment. Dozens, hundreds, even thousands of trees, all different ages and species, standing shoulder to shoulder. Above ground, they compete for light. Below ground, they're part of an information superhighway, a fungal-mediated network that allows them to send chemical messages, transfer sugars and nutrients, and possibly even warn each other about dangers. Let's get into how this actually works, because it's one thing to say trees talk, and another thing to explain how an organism with no mouth, no brain, and no Twitter account manages to do it. At the heart of the Wood Wide Web are those same mycorrhizal fungi we met earlier. These fungi form mutualistic relationships with trees, essentially plugging into their roots. Once they've latched on, they begin to grow long thread-like structures called hyphae, which extend through the soil in all directions. These hyphae link up with the roots of other trees, forming a massive network, one that's constantly growing, changing, and responding to conditions in the forest. Think of each tree as a server, and the fungal hyphae as the fiber optic cables connecting them. The trees produce sugars through photosynthesis, turning sunlight into food, and send some of that down into their roots to feed the fungi. In return, the fungi provide minerals like phosphorus and nitrogen, which are harder for the trees to access on their own. But it's not just a two-player transaction. Once connected to multiple trees, the fungi start facilitating transfers between them. Imagine this. A tall, healthy Douglas fir in a sunny patch of forest sends some of its extra sugars through the fungal network to a younger fir growing in the shade. Not because the tall tree is feeling especially charitable, but because it's part of a larger system that functions best when all its parts are strong. Forests that share survive better. Dr. Simard's experiments helped prove this. She and her team injected carbon isotopes into specific trees to trace how the carbon moved underground. What they found was startling, that carbon ended up not just in the roots of the injected tree, but in the roots of other trees nearby. And not randomly either. There was a clear preference. Older trees helped younger ones. Healthier trees helped weaker ones. Sometimes even different species pitched in to support each other. One especially poetic finding was that when a tree was dying, say due to disease or drought, it would sometimes send a final burst of its stored carbon into the network, a last act of generosity before it returned to the soil. It's not entirely clear whether this is an intentional process in the way we understand intention, but it's a powerful image, a tree's last breath becoming another's nourishment. And the generosity doesn't stop at food. Trees can also use this network to send chemical signals in response to stress. If one tree is attacked by pests, say aphids or caterpillars with a grudge, it can release signals into the fungal web. Neighbouring trees pick up the call and begin ramping up their own defences, producing bitter-tasting chemicals in their leaves or sending out compounds to attract predators of the pests. It's like nature's version of ringing the neighbourhood alarm bell. And unlike us humans, who often ignore warning emails, trees actually listen. This underground alert system is impressively sophisticated, though it works slowly. Signals can take hours or even days to travel through the fungal network, but that's still fast enough to make a real difference in the slow-motion world of tree life. Imagine being able to protect yourself from danger before it arrives, thanks to a whisper through the roots. It's slow-motion preemptive strategy. Now, before we go all gooey with forest feelings, it's worth noting that not every tree is equally helpful. Some trees give generously to the network, others take more than they give. The fungi themselves, while generally cooperative, can also play favourites, directing resources to trees that offer more sugars or to species they're better adapted to. In this underground economy, generosity is often balanced with cold carbon-based economics. Even with that in mind, the overall effect is one of surprising cooperation. This changes how we think about forests, not as loose collections of organisms, but as complex interdependent systems. What affects one tree can ripple through the network and influence many others. It's not unlike a living brain where signals and responses flow in a decentralized but meaningful way. And remember, this isn't science fiction, it's science. Peer-reviewed, repeatedly tested, and now forming the basis for better forest management practices around the world. Loggers, for instance, are now more cautious about removing mother trees, those central hubs in the network, because doing so can harm the health of the entire forest community. It turns out, cutting down the right tree can be like deleting an essential line of code. Things stop working the way they should. So the next time you stroll through the woods and see a tree, imagine the hidden threads beneath it. Threads that stretch out like veins, connecting one trunk to the next. Threads that carry not just food and water, but warnings, wisdom, and whispers of cooperation. And while we may never hear those whispers with our ears, we can still listen, with a little wonder and maybe a little more respect, for the quiet conversations happening just below the surface. Deep in the forest there are giants, not the kind from fairy tales with booming voices and enormous boots, but green ancient beings who have watched centuries come and go. These giants stand tall, roots buried deep in the soil, branches swaying with a kind of timeless patience. They don't stomp or shout, but they do something far more impressive. They nurture. Scientists have discovered that these towering elders, sometimes hundreds of years old, play a central role in the underground network of forests. They're not just big trees with good sunlight real estate. They're providers, caregivers, and hubs of communication. Researchers affectionately call them mother trees. Now, don't let the term throw you off. These trees aren't mothers in the way we typically think of animals raising young. They don't hand out lunchboxes or remind saplings to wear a jacket. But they do send nutrients, chemical signals, and other resources to younger trees, especially their own offspring, and they do it through the intricate fungal network beneath the forest floor. Dr. Suzanne Simard, who we met before, was a major force in uncovering this phenomenon. In one of her most famous experiments, she traced carbon isotopes from older trees to nearby saplings, and discovered that the older trees weren't just keeping their carbon to themselves, they were actively feeding it to younger trees, particularly to those that were genetically related. Yes, somehow the trees could recognize their kin. The implications are quietly staggering. It means forests are not just communities of random individuals, they are structured, familial, and deeply interconnected. A mother tree doesn't just drop seeds and wish them luck, she supports her young for years, sometimes even decades, helping them grow strong enough to one day join the canopy. Imagine being a tiny sapling in the shady understory. You're barely tall enough to catch the sunlight. Photosynthesis is hard work when the sun only sends you scraps. But then, through the fungal network, a nearby mother tree, perhaps your mother, starts sending you a trickle of carbon, nitrogen, and water. It's not enough to make you tall overnight, but it's enough to survive the critical years, to keep growing when others fade. These mother trees don't just play favourites either. They help keep the entire forest stable. Like an old, wise elder in a village, they pass on resources to those in need, support the community during hard times, and hold everything together with their roots, literally and figuratively. Some trees, like Douglas firs, are especially central to these networks. In some forests, a single mother tree can be connected to hundreds of others. Think of her like the server room of the forest, quietly humming away, sending out vital information and supplies, while all the younger trees benefit from her stability. And the nurturing doesn't stop when disaster strikes. In fact, it often becomes more intense. If a mother tree is injured, perhaps by a storm, a drought, or human logging, it may send a final burst of its resources through the network before it dies. This last act can support neighbouring trees, especially its young, giving them a better shot at survival. It's a poignant, almost poetic end, passing on life even in death. But it's not just about carbon and nutrients. These trees also send signals, chemical messages that help others prepare for threats. If a pest is munching on leaves or a disease is moving through the forest, that information gets passed along. Young trees can then start producing protective compounds or strengthen their defences. It's like getting a forest-wide emergency alert, only without the terrifying cell phone vibration. There's something deeply comforting about this idea, that even in the plant kingdom care exists, that old trees look after the young, and that strength is shared, not hoarded. It challenges the old Darwinian stereotype of survival of the fittest as a cutthroat competition. In forests, survival often depends on connection. Of course, not every tree gets the same treatment. Some younger trees, those not related to a nearby mother tree, might receive fewer resources. It's a little forest favoritism, but not entirely unfair. Investing in your genetic offspring helps ensure your lineage survives. Still, the networks often benefit the community overall. Even unrelated saplings gain access to signals and nutrients that increase their odds of making it to adulthood. This complex, cooperative web isn't just beautiful, it's practical. By sharing resources and information, forests become more resilient. If one tree is struggling, others can help. If one species is under threat, the system can adapt. Mother trees are a key part of that adaptability. But here's where things get a little bittersweet. These mother trees, these elders of the forest, are often the first to be removed during logging operations. They're big, valuable, and easier to target, but taking them out doesn't just remove one tree, it unravels a whole network. Without the central hubs, young saplings lose their lifelines, regeneration slows, the forest becomes more vulnerable to pests, drought, and collapse. Thankfully, this knowledge is beginning to change forestry practices. More and more ecologists are advocating for the protection of these keystone individuals. Leaving mother trees in place during selective logging helps maintain forest health and speeds up recovery. It's a small shift with a big impact. And it's not just happening in remote wilderness. Urban forestry is picking up on this too. Some cities are mapping tree networks, recognizing the importance of large, old trees in parks and green spaces, because even a single tree, properly placed and connected, can help cool the air, clean the soil, and support the growth of others nearby. So the next time you walk through a forest and look up at a towering tree, take a moment. Think of her roots stretching wide beneath the ground, linking her to a network of neighbours and family. Think of the nutrients pulsing silently from her trunk to a sapling struggling to survive. Think of her, not just as a tree, but as a keeper of wisdom, a provider of life, and a silent, steadfast guardian of the forest. In a world that often feels divided and rushed, it's comforting to know that somewhere, quietly, the forest remembers how to take care of its own. In the cool hush of a forest, you might think the only communication going on is the occasional squirrel-related outburst or the quiet gossip of leaves in the wind. After all, trees don't talk, at least not in the way we're used to. But as it turns out, they do communicate in ways that are surprisingly clever, almost sneaky, and definitely effective. While much of the forest conversation happens underground through fungal networks, trees also have an impressive above-ground communication system. Chemical messages sent through the air. Yes, trees can talk on the breeze, just very, very slowly. Let's say a hungry caterpillar starts munching on the leaves of an acacia tree. Not exactly a national emergency, unless you're the acacia. But instead of silently enduring its slow, leafy doom, the tree fights back. It starts pumping out bitter-tasting tannins into its leaves, making itself far less appetizing. That's the tree version of slamming the fridge door shut on an uninvited guest. But it doesn't stop there. The acacia also releases volatile organic compounds, VOCs for short, into the air. These are chemicals that waft through the forest on the wind and act as distress signals. Nearby trees sniff these signals and begin beefing up their own chemical defenses before the caterpillars even arrive. It's like a preemptive security upgrade, triggered by the botanical equivalent of a warning text from a neighbour. This kind of airborne warning system is remarkably widespread in the plant kingdom. Researchers have found that poplars, pines, maples, and even tomatoes can send these signals. When damaged or threatened, plants emit a unique cocktail of VOCs that can trigger responses in others nearby. These might include producing bitter compounds, releasing toxins, or in some cases, attracting predators of the attacker. Yes, plants can call for backup, and take wild tobacco, for example. When it's being chewed on by a hornworm, a particularly greedy caterpillar, it releases a scent into the air that attracts parasitic wasps. These wasps, with impeccable timing and poor table manners, swoop in and lay their eggs inside the hornworm. The larvae then feast from within, and the tobacco plant lives to photosynthesize another day. Brutal, efficient, and surprisingly well coordinated for a species that doesn't have a brain. Now, you might wonder, how do trees smell these chemical messages? They don't have noses, after all. True, but what they do have are specialized receptors on their leaves and surfaces that can detect specific VOCs. When these molecules bind to the receptors, they trigger a cascade of responses inside the plant, flipping on defense genes, activating chemical pathways, and setting the leafy equivalent of battle stations to full alert. This kind of eavesdropping isn't limited to close relatives. While trees of the same species are more responsive to each other's signals, perhaps due to more closely matched chemical dialects, many different plants can understand each other's VOCs. It's not quite a universal language, but it's impressively multilingual for something that floats invisibly on the breeze. It's not just danger that's shared this way. Some scientists believe plants may also release chemical signals during growth or flowering, potentially influencing the timing and development of nearby plants. This makes sense in a dense forest where coordination might be beneficial, like flowering at the same time to increase pollination success. After all, there's strength in numbers, even when you're trying to impress bees. Now, this air-based communication might sound like a secondary system compared to the vast underground fungal networks, but it has its advantages. First, it's fast. While route-based signals may take hours or days to travel, VOCs can spread within minutes, riding on the breeze to reach nearby trees. And unlike underground connections, which require a physical network, these messages can reach trees that aren't even part of the same fungal system. Of course, the drawback is that VOC signals don't travel far, usually no more than about 30 meters. That's roughly the length of 3 school buses, which is plenty if you're a tree, but not great for long-distance strategy meetings. Still, in a dense forest, that range can cover dozens of neighbouring trees, creating a tight-knit community that stays informed and alert. Interestingly, some trees appear to be more generous communicators than others. Just like in human neighbourhoods, some plants are quick to send out alerts, while others are a little more reserved or even selfish. Scientists have noted that stressed trees sometimes save their energy and avoid sending out VOCs, possibly to conserve resources. or perhaps they just don't feel like making small talk while being eaten. Understandable, really. And then there are the plants that have evolved to exploit this communication. Some parasitic plants can detect the VOCs of stressed hosts and use them to locate new targets. Others can tune into a nearby tree's distress call and prepare themselves without ever being directly threatened. It's a bit like standing outside a bakery to smell the bread, then sprinting inside before the queue forms. Communication doesn't stop at the air and soil either. There's evidence that trees might influence each other through root exudates, chemicals released into the soil that affect the growth or behavior of nearby plants. Some trees even produce allelopathic chemicals that inhibit the growth of competitors. It's not exactly a friendly conversation, but it is a kind of message. This is my spot. Kindly grow elsewhere. All of this paints a much more dynamic picture of plant life than we're used to. Trees aren't passive, they're not slow in any meaningful sense, just tuned to a different rhythm. Instead of minutes and hours, they move in days, seasons, and decades. Their signals may be silent to us, but they're rich in meaning and complexity. And the forest listens. So the next time you find yourself in a quiet grove, take a breath. That cool, earthy scent, it might just contain the whispers of 1,000 leafy conversations. Warnings, invitations, maybe even a bit of forest gossip drifting past your nose on an invisible tide of molecules. You may not speak tree, but trees? They've been speaking all along. If the trees are the voices of the forest, then the fungi are its telephone lines, quiet, hidden, indispensable. These humble organisms, often overlooked and underestimated, are at the heart of everything. The great green cathedral of the forest may get all the attention, but without fungi, the whole thing would unravel. Or more accurately, it would never have come together in the first place. Let's revisit our old friends, the mycorrhizal fungi. These organisms are part of a huge group of soil-dwelling fungi that form intimate partnerships with the roots of plants. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. The fungi get access to the sugars trees produce through photosynthesis, and in return they help those trees absorb water and minerals from the soil. But the role of these fungi goes far beyond being mere nutrient delivery boys. They are the brokers, translators, and middlemen of the forest. There are two main types of mycorrhizal fungi, ectomycorrhizal and arbuscular mycorrhizal. They differ in how they associate with plant roots, and, like any good fungal family, they each have their specialties. Ectomycorrhizal fungi wrap themselves around the outside of the root, forming a sort of sheath, like a cozy sock. They create a network of filaments around the root cells, but they don't actually go inside. These fungi often form relationships with larger trees, like pines, oaks, birches, and beeches. They're the ones responsible for those classic visible mushrooms you might see popping up from the forest floor. Chanterelles, boletes, truffles if you're lucky and very rich. Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, on the other hand, take a more intimate approach. They actually penetrate the root cells themselves, forming tiny tree-shaped structures, hence the name arbuscular, from the Latin arbusculum, meaning little tree. These structures increase the surface area available for nutrient exchange. These fungi tend to associate with grasses, shrubs, and tropical plants, and while they don't produce the dramatic mushrooms of their ectomycorrhizal cousins, they are far more ancient. Some evidence suggests they've been forming partnerships with plants for over 400 million years, long before any forests as we know them existed. So what's the big deal about these relationships? Well, imagine you're a tree. You're rooted in one place for your entire life, completely dependent on the soil around you. But the nutrients you need, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, are often trapped in hard-to-reach pockets or bound up in forms your roots can't easily absorb. That's where fungi come in. Their thread-like hyphae are absurdly fine, far thinner than root hairs, and they can weave through the tiniest soil spaces, accessing water and nutrients that would otherwise be out of reach. The fungi then transfer those nutrients to the tree in exchange for sugars. This isn't charity, it's business. And like any economy, there's negotiation. Trees can allocate more sugars to fungi that are delivering more nutrients, and fungi can in turn favour trees that are more generous. It's a two-way trade network, constantly shifting in response to supply and demand. It's been compared to a stock exchange, only with less shouting and fewer suits. The fascinating part is that this fungal network connects multiple trees, sometimes even trees of different species. Through this network, resources can move from one tree to another, depending on need, health, and age. For example, a tall spruce with access to sunlight might send excess carbon to a younger sapling in the shade, or an older tree nearing the end of its life might release its stored nutrients to others nearby. But fungi aren't just passive carriers, they make choices. Studies have shown that fungi can decide where to send nutrients based on which trees are providing more sugar in return. They also seem to prioritize relationships with specific partners. Some fungi specialize in certain tree species, forming near-exclusive bonds. Others are generalists, happy to mingle with a wide variety of plants. In this sense, fungi are selective collaborators, part matchmaker, part logistics coordinator, part shrewd investor. Interestingly, some fungi can even influence plant behavior. Certain species seem to affect root growth patterns, shoot development, or even the plant's internal chemistry. Some researchers believe that fungi might encourage host plants to behave in ways that benefit the network, though that's a hot topic still being explored. Whether it's subtle manipulation or just co-evolution, the fungi are more than just passengers on the forest train. Now, it's not all cooperation and harmony. There are freeloaders in this system too, both among the trees and the fungi. Some plants, like certain orchids, tap into the fungal network to receive nutrients without giving much in return. And some fungi form relationships that appear less helpful and more parasitic, siphoning off sugars with little benefit to the host. Nature is full of give and take, but it's rarely fair. Still, in a healthy forest, the system tends to balance out. The fungal network helps redistribute resources, stabilize ecosystems, and buffer the effects of drought or poor soil. It enables trees to survive in tough conditions and helps forests recover from disturbances. When a tree falls, the fungi help recycle its nutrients back into the network. When new seedlings sprout, they often connect to the network through nearby roots, gaining access to the community's collective strength. And there's something almost magical about how little of this is visible to us. We walk through forests unaware that under every step is a living web of fungal threads, quietly moving information, materials and signals between trees, a network so vast and complex that it rivals the human brain in terms of connectivity, yet most of us have never even heard of it. But that's the thing about fungi. They're quiet operators. No fanfare, no flashiness, just slow, deliberate networking. The ultimate introverts. And yet, without them, there would be no forests. Just a scattered mess of struggling plants trying and probably failing to make it on their own. So the next time you see a mushroom pushing up through the leaf litter, don't just think of it as a quirky forest decoration. That's just the fruiting body, the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it is a vast, unseen empire of filaments and cells, working tirelessly to keep the forest alive, connected, and thriving. In a way, the forest isn't just trees or fungi or roots, it's all of it together, a single breathing system with thousands of voices, all speaking through threads of fungi. A whisper in the soil, a secret under every step. The forest is a place of quiet cooperation, where trees share nutrients, fungi act as middlemen, and warnings flow through air and soil like leafy telegrams. It's a vision of unity, harmony, and gentle symbiosis. But let's not be too romantic about it. Nature is generous, yes, but she also has a competitive streak. Beneath all the friendly exchanges and nurturing roots, there's a constant tug-of-war going on. Trees are not just neighbours, they're rivals. Rivals for sunlight, water, minerals, and space. Cooperation exists, certainly, but so does competition. And sometimes the forest doesn't whisper, it jostles. Let's start with the most obvious resource, light. Sunlight is the lifeblood of trees. Through photosynthesis, trees turn sunlight into sugars, the primary energy source for themselves and their fungal partners. But light is a limited commodity, especially in dense forests where the canopy forms a thick green ceiling. Up there, it's a race to the top. This competition starts early. Saplings stretch upward, desperately trying to break into the light. Some grow tall and slender, sacrificing stability for height in their quest. Others spread broad leaves to capture whatever photons manage to filter through. Those that can't get enough light slowly starve, no matter how cooperative their underground connections may be. It's survival of the sunniest. Now, not all species play by the same rules. Some are what ecologists call shade-tolerant, species that can bide their time under the canopy, growing slowly in low light until a larger tree falls and opens a sunny patch. Others are shade-intolerant, needing bright open spaces to thrive. The balance between these types helps shape the overall composition of a forest, and Yes, sometimes even drives a bit of passive-aggressive jostling. But the trees don't just compete vertically. Underground, the battle continues. Roots spread wide and deep, probing for the water and nutrients. Where one tree's roots extend, another's may be crowded out. In areas where resources are scarce, root systems grow denser and more aggressive. Some trees even produce allelopathic chemicals, compounds that inhibit the growth of other plants nearby. A famous example of this is the black walnut tree, Juglans nigra, which produces a chemical called juglone. Juglone seeps into the soil and effectively poisons the surrounding area for many plant species. It's not an act of spite, it's strategy. By reducing competition, the walnut tree ensures more resources for itself. The result is a zone of poor plant growth known as a juglone shadow, where even the most enthusiastic gardener's flowers tend to mysteriously wilt. Other plants have their own chemical tricks. Eucalyptus trees, for instance, drop leaves that contain oils inhibiting the germination of other seeds. Desert shrubs like creosote release volatile compounds to reduce nearby competition. It's like a botanical version of claiming your space with an invisible fence. And yet these competitive strategies don't negate the communication and cooperation we've already explored. In fact, they coexist in a kind of dynamic balance. Sometimes the same species will share nutrients and signals while also competing for resources. Trees, like humans, contain multitudes. They can be generous and territorial, helpful and ruthless, all at the same time. One fascinating concept in forest ecology is called the nurse effect. In tough environments, such as alpine regions or deserts, certain nurse plants provide shade, protection, and even moisture to seedlings growing nearby. These nurse plants create microclimates that improve survival rates for younger plants, often even different species. It's a bit of selfless parenting, until the young plant grows large enough to become a competitor. There's also the matter of timing. Some trees drop their leaves early in autumn, freeing up light and nutrients for others. Others cling to their leaves long past the point of usefulness, perhaps to deny their neighbours that same luxury. It's a game of strategy played out slowly, yet season after season. Below ground, fungal networks also reflect this complexity. A tree connected to the wood wide web might send nutrients to a neighbour during hard times, but only if the network's budget allows it. If resources are too scarce, the flow stops. Some trees may even attempt to manipulate the network, sending signals or sugars that favour their own growth over others. Scientists have also discovered something called root grafting, where the roots of two trees, often of the same species, grow together and fuse, creating a direct link for nutrient sharing. This can be a powerful form of cooperation, especially in forests facing drought or poor soil, but it also opens the door to parasitism. If one tree is sick or dying, it might drain resources from a healthier partner, pulling it down too. Connection is powerful, but not always beneficial. So where does this leave us? Are forest battlegrounds or communities? The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, is both. Forests are living tapestries woven from threads of competition and cooperation, generosity and self-interest. Trees support one another through shared networks, but also battle for sunlight and soil. Fungi form partnerships with trees, but sometimes play favourites. Plants communicate warnings, but also sabotage their rivals. It's not a world of good versus evil, it's a world of balance, complex, nuanced, and deeply interconnected. In some ways, this dynamic tension is what makes forests so resilient. A system that includes both cooperation and competition can adapt to changing conditions. It can recover from damage, respond to threats, and continue growing despite setbacks. Like any thriving community, it needs both kindness and boundaries. And perhaps that's one of the quiet lessons of the forest. That strength doesn't come from isolation or dominance, but from the messy, tangled interplay of support and rivalry. That life flourishes not because everyone gets along, but because the system makes space for both giving and taking, both growth and decay. So the next time you walk among the trees, remember that you're witnessing a living paradox. A place where old giants lift their neighbours toward the sky, even as their roots duel in silence below. A place where a single seedling might be nurtured one day and challenged the next. A forest, after all, is not just a place of peace, it's a place of purpose. And the trees? They're playing the long game, long before tree roots were seen as anything more than anchors in the soil or passive drinking straws for water. The idea that plants could communicate was largely dismissed. Trees were thought of as solitary, silent organisms, living sure, but not really doing much beyond growing, reproducing, and eventually toppling over in a dignified crunch. That perspective began to shift, slowly but surely, thanks to a growing number of curious scientists who were willing to quite literally dig deeper. What they uncovered, both figuratively and with actual shovels, rewrote our understanding of forests, trees, and even communication itself. One of the pioneers of this research is Dr. Suzanne Simard. As a young forester working in the dense woodlands of British Columbia, she began noticing strange patterns: young trees that thrived under certain older trees, saplings that seemed to survive even when, on paper, they should have withered away. There was something more going on in the forest than the traditional every tree for itself model could explain. So she asked a simple question: could trees be helping each other? To find out, she designed an experiment that would make most gardeners do a double take. She took two tree species, paper birch and Douglas fir, and planted them together in the forest. Then, using radioactive carbon isotopes, she labelled the carbon in the birch trees by feeding them specially marked CO2. The idea was to track the movement of carbon molecules. If the trees were truly isolated, the labelled carbon should stay in the birches. It didn't. Within days, the radioactive carbon showed up in the Douglas firs. Carbon, essentially sugar made by the birch's photosynthesis, had travelled from one tree's roots to another's, and not by chance. When the fir trees were shaded and struggling to make food, the carbon transfer increased. Later in the season, when the birches lost their leaves and stopped photosynthesizing, the firs returned the favour. It was the forest equivalent of two neighbours swapping flour and sugar depending on who had more in the pantry. This finding was a revelation. Trees weren't just competing, they were cooperating. Not always, and not with everyone, but enough to suggest that forests were functioning less like a collection of individuals and more like a community, a society, or, in the words of Simard and others, a kind of superorganism. Simard's work built on earlier research into the strange, intimate relationships between plant roots and fungi. Mycorrhizal networks had been known for decades. Scientists had observed them under microscopes, catalogued species, even grown them in lab conditions. But until the 90s, their role in tree-to-tree communication was barely understood. The problem wasn't lack of evidence, it was lack of imagination. For much of the 20th century, the dominant ecological models emphasized competition. Darwinian survival of the fittest was interpreted in forests as a ruthless struggle for sunlight, space, and nutrients. Cooperative behavior, if it existed, was often brushed aside as a fluke or artifact. Besides, how could trees talk? They had no brains, no mouths, no nervous systems. But communication doesn't require a voice or a brain. It just requires a signal, a response, and a purpose. And so, one by one, researchers started turning over the metaphorical forest floor. Using carbon isotopes, DNA sequencing, and advanced microscopy, they uncovered a world that had always been there, an underground information highway built from fungal threads and chemical signals. In Japan, researchers studying willows and poplars found that plants under insect attack released airborne chemical signals that were detected by nearby trees, which then began ramping up their own chemical defences. In Sweden, experiments with bean plants showed that underground signalling occurred even when above-ground cues were eliminated. In Africa, studies of acacia trees demonstrated how giraffe browsing triggered tannin production, not just in the grazed tree, but in its neighbours downwind. Bit by bit, the idea of plant communication began to lose its fringe science status. What had once sounded like botanical science fiction was becoming botanical fact. Of course, as with any emerging field, not everyone agreed on the interpretations. Some critics argued that calling these interactions communication was too anthropomorphic, that it implied intentionality or consciousness where none existed. After all, a plant can't decide to send a message, can it? But others argued that intention wasn't necessary. Communication in the biological sense simply means the transfer of information that changes behaviour. Whether it's a tree sending carbon to a sapling, or a flower producing scent to attract a pollinator, the effect is the same. One organism changes another's behaviour through a signal. And if that signal helps both survive, even better. Meanwhile, the science marched on. More recent studies have delved into the complexities of fungal behaviour. Some fungi appear to act strategically, directing nutrients to trees that are more generous in return. Others prioritise kin over strangers, or favour certain species. There's evidence that fungal networks can carry not just nutrients and warning signals, but even electrical impulses, tiny voltage changes that resemble, in form if not in function, the nerve impulses found in animals. None of this is to say that trees are thinking beings, planning their next move, or composing forest symphonies, but it does mean they are far more dynamic than once believed. Trees respond to their environment. They communicate, they adapt, and perhaps most humbling of all, they've been doing it for millions of years, quietly, efficiently, without anyone watching. It's only recently that we've started to listen. So the next time you see a forest, try not to think of it as a group of trees standing independently. Think of it as a community, a place where signals flow through roots and air, where nutrients move from the strong to the weak, where fungi stitch everything together with invisible threads. It took decades of science, patience, and quite a few radioactive isotopes to uncover this world. But now that we know it's there, we can never look at forests the same way again. And perhaps that's the point. Sometimes the most profound connections are the ones we've always walked right over. What does it mean to be intelligent? For most of us, intelligence is about problem solving, memory, learning, perhaps even self-awareness. We associate it with neurons and brains, with animals that can pass mirror tests or navigate mazes. Trees, by contrast, are quiet, rooted, and, on the surface, entirely brainless. Yet the more we learn about them, the harder it becomes to deny that there is something curiously smart about how they operate. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Trees don't have minds, they don't ponder philosophy or worry about whether their leaves are fashionable this season, but they do respond to their environments in ways that suggest a remarkable degree of sophistication. In fact, many scientists now refer to this phenomenon as plant intelligence, not because trees are conscious, but because they exhibit behaviors that require perception, memory, adaptation, and decision-making, all without a single neuron. Let's start with perception. Trees may not have eyes or ears, but they are constantly monitoring their surroundings. Through specialized proteins and receptors, they can detect changes in light, temperature, moisture, gravity, and chemical signals in the air and soil. A tree knows where the sun is, how dry the ground is, and whether its neighbour has just been bitten by something with too many legs. This awareness allows trees to respond with incredible nuance. For example, when a tree senses that it's growing in the shade of another, it will shift its growth strategy, elongating its trunk faster to reach the light, or redirecting its branches to find better sun exposure. That's not just passive growth, that's reactive growth, shaped by external stimuli. Or consider how trees handle drought. When water becomes scarce, a tree doesn't just wilt like a forgotten houseplant. It carefully regulates the opening and closing of tiny pores on its leaves, called stomata, to reduce water loss while still taking in carbon dioxide. It may also divert growth energy away from leaves and branches to prioritize root expansion, digging deeper into the soil for hidden moisture reserves. If the drought is prolonged, the tree may even shed leaves altogether, a kind of controlled shutdown to conserve energy until conditions improve. All of this suggests a decision-making process, albeit one driven by biochemistry rather than thought. But here's where things get even more interesting. Trees appear to remember. One famous study involved mimosa plants, which are known for folding their leaves inward when touched. Scientists repeatedly dropped the plants a short distance, causing no harm but triggering their leaf-folding reflex. At first, the plants responded every time, but after a few drops they stopped reacting. They had learned that the fall posed no threat. When tested again hours, days, and even weeks later, they still remembered, not reacting to the drop but still closing their leaves in response to other unfamiliar stimuli. These are small plants, not trees, but the implications are enormous. The plants demonstrated a form of habituation, a basic kind of learning observed in animals, and they did it without a nervous system. So could trees do the same? There's growing evidence to suggest they can. Some studies show that trees remember seasonal changes and adjust their growth cycles accordingly. After experiencing early frosts, for instance, some species delay budding the following year, protecting their tender leaves from a repeat performance. This isn't reflexive behaviour. It's an adjustment based on past experience. Trees also show remarkable adaptability. In environments where nutrients are patchy or competition is high, their roots grow strategically, faster and deeper where minerals are rich, slower where the soil is poor. They can even avoid toxic substances in the soil or grow away from root systems of aggressive neighbours. It's spatial awareness, without the eyes. And perhaps most compelling of all, trees exhibit what ecologists call anticipatory behaviour. When a neighbouring tree releases distress signals, such as VOCs indicating insect attack, other trees begin producing protective chemicals before the insects reach them. They aren't reacting to damage, they're preparing for it. This kind of proactive behaviour suggests an internal ability to process, interpret, and respond to complex cues. Still, none of this implies consciousness. Trees don't dream. They don't have thoughts or emotions in the way animals do. But what they do have is a different kind of intelligence, one embedded in their physiology, their structure, and their relationships with other organisms. Some scientists have proposed the idea of decentralized intelligence. Unlike animals, which localize thinking in a brain, plants spread their information processing throughout the body. Roots sense and respond to soil conditions. Leaves detect light levels and airborne chemicals. Branches and buds adjust their growth in response to local feedback. It's like a computer without a central processor, just a vast distributed network of input and output. If that sounds familiar, it should. Fungal networks in forests operate the same way. So do social insect colonies. Intelligence, it turns out, doesn't have to wear the shape of a skull. That said, the question of whether trees are intelligent depends largely on how we define the term. If intelligence means responding to the environment, learning from experience, anticipating future events, and making strategic choices, then yes, trees tick quite a few of those boxes. But if intelligence requires self-awareness, deliberation, or creativity, then no, the forest is not filled with leafy philosophers. And yet, perhaps that's missing the point. What trees demonstrate is not the intelligence of a single mind, but the wisdom of an evolved system. Millions of years of trial and error have refined them into organisms that can survive fire, drought, flood, and infestation. They've learned through the slow march of natural selection to use signals, networks, and relationships in ways that give them an edge. Their intelligence isn't fast, it's not flashy, but it is deeply, quietly effective. And maybe that's a different kind of brilliance, one that doesn't need neurons to flourish, one that operates on the timescale of centuries, not seconds. So the next time you pass a tree, any tree really, consider this. That massive trunk and rustling canopy might not be thinking in the way you are, but it's still solving problems, still adapting, still responding to the world around it with a grace that's both ancient and profoundly alive. Not a mind, perhaps, but a memory and a message, written in roots and leaves and read, if only we're patient enough, over time. Step into a forest and you're entering a world millions of years in the making. Trees tower above you, roots spread wide below, fungi twist through the soil like invisible veins, and everything hums, quietly, patiently, with life. But how did it all begin? How did these silent giants and their microscopic partners evolve such an intricate system of connection, support, and survival? To answer that, we need to wind the clock back, way, way back. Before the first forests, before trees, before flowers, back to a time when life on land was just beginning to take hold. About 500 million years ago, Earth was a very different place. The continents were mostly barren rock. The atmosphere was thick with carbon dioxide, and the only life forms were in the oceans. Simple algae, bacteria, and tiny marine organisms. But somewhere along the fringes of these ancient seas, a few pioneering plants began to venture ashore. These early land plants were nothing like the trees we know today. They were small, leafless, and lacked roots. Think more like moss or liverwort than oak or maple, and on their own they wouldn't have stood much of a chance. The land was harsh. Nutrients were locked in the soil, inaccessible without specialized tools. Water was scarce. Ultraviolet radiation was intense. For these early plants, survival was a tall order. Enter the fungi. Fungi had already been thriving on land for millions of years, breaking down rock, forming symbiotic relationships with bacteria, and exploring the soil with their fine, thread-like hyphae. When plants showed up, the fungi were ready. The two struck a deal, a partnership that changed the course of life on Earth. Fungi offered plants access to water and minerals, especially phosphorus, in exchange for a share of the sugars the plants produced through photosynthesis. It was a win-win, and it's likely that this relationship, called mycorrhiza, was a key reason plants were able to colonize land at all. We know this not just from modern biology, but from fossils. ancient plant remains dating back 400 million years show clear evidence of fungal structures inside their tissues. These arbuscular mycorrhizal relationships are still found in 80 to 90% of plant species today, a living reminder of that ancient alliance. As plants became more successful, they began to evolve. Leaves appeared, capturing more sunlight, roots grew longer, exploring deeper soil, and eventually plants developed vascular systems to transport water and nutrients more efficiently. This paved the way for taller, more complex forms, shrubs, then trees. Forests emerged for the first time around 385 million years ago during the late Devonian period. These early forests were filled with the strange, spindly trees, many without leaves in the modern sense, but they were game changers. By photosynthesizing on a massive scale, these forests began pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which in turn helped cool the planet and reshape the climate. The Carboniferous period, beginning around 359 million years ago, saw an explosion of plant life. Giant ferns, towering horsetails, and seedless trees dominated vast swampy forests. Oxygen levels soared, even supporting giant insects like dragonflies the size of seagulls. Charming or terrifying, you decide. As forests expanded, so did the complexity of plant life. Plants developed seeds, which allowed them to spread more effectively. Later, flowers evolved, ushering in a new era of plant-pollinator partnerships. But through it all, the relationship with fungi never went away. In fact, it grew even more sophisticated. Fungal networks evolved alongside plants, adapting to new tree species and changing environmental conditions. Ectomycorrhizal fungi appeared, forming relationships with temperate trees like pines, birches, and oaks. These fungi were particularly good at mobilizing nutrients in nutrient-poor soils, giving their tree partners a vital edge in cooler, drier environments. At the same time, forests themselves began to change from simple collections of trees into dynamic ecosystems, rich with undergrowth, decomposers, insects, birds, and mammals. And within these bustling communities, the subtle power of underground fungal networks began to take shape. Why did communication and cooperation evolve? That's a deep question, and one that scientists are still exploring. But the basic logic is clear. In a stable, long-lived ecosystem like a forest, cooperation can be an excellent strategy for survival. Trees don't move, they don't reproduce quickly, they invest heavily in long-term growth. So it makes sense that they would evolve ways to support their offspring, warn their neighbours, and adapt to slow changes over time. Likewise, fungi benefit from stable host relationships. Keeping trees healthy means more sugar for the fungi. The more they help the forest thrive, the more they thrive. This is known as a mutualism, a relationship in which both partners benefit. And in forests, it's often a networked mutualism, involving dozens or even hundreds of species all connected by invisible fungal threads. In many ways, evolution has selected for forests that function less like a loose group of competitors and more like a single, sprawling superorganism. That doesn't mean everything's peaceful. As we saw earlier, trees still compete for light and nutrients, fungi still play favourites, and some plants cheat the system. But the forest as a whole is more resilient because of its connection. When drought hits, or pests arrive, or a fire burns through, the network helps the ecosystem recover. The trees that survive share resources. The fungi rebuild the web. Life continues. One might be tempted to call this kind of wisdom, not in the conscious sense, but in the sense of systems refined by time. Evolution isn't thoughtful, but it is thorough. Over hundreds of millions of years, it has selected for behaviours and structures that work, quietly, elegantly, often invisibly. And we're just beginning to understand the depth of that wisdom. Until recently, scientists assumed that forests were shaped primarily by competition and randomness. But with each new study, we see more evidence of cooperation, complexity, and intentional seeming behaviour, products not of thought, but of slow, shared adaptation. So the next time you look at a forest, try to see not just the trees, but the timeline. Each trunk a descendant of ancient pioneers, each root a continuation of an ancient pact, each fallen leaf a whisper from a world that began long before us. Forests aren't just old, they're ancient archives of evolutionary knowledge, and if we listen closely, beneath the leaves, beneath the soil, they still have stories to tell. Forests are ancient, wise, and wonderfully self-sufficient, but they are not invincible. For most of their long history, forests evolved and flourished with relatively little interference from humans. Lightning struck, fires burned, rivers shifted, volcanoes erupted, and still the forests returned, reshaped but resilient. But over the last few centuries, something new entered the picture. Humans with axes, sawmills, bulldozers, and blueprints. Turns out that while trees may take centuries to grow, they can be felled in minutes. And the silent, invisible networks that support those trees, the fungal threads, the underground symphonies of nutrient sharing, the mother trees nurturing their young, those can be torn apart even faster. Let's begin with logging. On the surface, cutting down trees seems simple. Take out the ones you need, leave the rest. But not all trees are equal. Removing an old growth tree isn't just about subtracting one big trunk from the landscape. You're removing a hub, an elder in the forest's underground social network, and with that comes consequences. Mother trees, as we've seen, play a central role in forest health. Their roots are deeply connected to many younger trees through the mycorrhizal network. They're information centers and resource banks. When one is cut down, it doesn't just vanish. It leaves behind a kind of silence in the soil. The nearby saplings may lose their strongest source of nutrients. Communication pathways are disrupted. The network weakens. It's a bit like removing a keystone from an arch. The rest may stand for a time, but the structure becomes fragile. The connections that once made the forest resilient to stress begin to fray. Modern forestry practices have started to acknowledge this. Retention forestry, for example, aims to leave some mother trees behind to maintain the network, support regeneration, and provide continuity. It's not perfect, but it's a step toward a more balanced relationship with the forests we depend on. But deforestation goes far beyond selective logging. In many parts of the world, entire forests are cleared for agriculture, grazing, mining, and urban expansion. The Amazon rainforest, sometimes called the lungs of the planet, loses thousands of square kilometers each year to cattle ranching and soybean farms. And it's not just the trees that are lost, it's the complex relationships between trees, fungi, animals, and microbes. It's entire living systems. When forests are fragmented, split into isolated patches by roads, farmland, or development, the underground networks are severed. Fungal connections can't bridge asphalt. Saplings that once received help from parent trees find themselves alone. Microclimates change, edge effects increase, invasive species move in, and slowly, quietly, the forest begins to unravel. Even well-intentioned efforts can go awry. Replanting trees is often touted as a solution to deforestation, and in many cases, it helps. But monoculture plantations, where a single species of fast-growing tree is planted over a wide area, don't recreate the complexity of a real forest. They lack biodiversity, underground networks, and long-term resilience. These forests may look green from above, but they're silent below. The fungal networks in real forests are built over decades. They require diversity, different tree species, different fungi, different soil conditions. In many cases, the specific fungal partners needed for proper forest function are absent from replanted areas. Without those partners, the new trees grow more slowly, resist disease less effectively, and provide less support to one another. It's a little like building a neighborhood without plumbing or electricity. It may look fine from the outside, but it doesn't quite work. And then there's climate change. Rising temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns, and more frequent extreme weather events are putting immense pressure on forests worldwide. Droughts dry out the soil, fires sweep through parched woodlands, and warmer winters allow pests like bark beetles to survive and spread in ways they never did before. Fungal networks are sensitive to these changes. Many mycorrhizal fungi depend on specific temperature and moisture conditions to thrive. When the soil dries out, or when temperatures rise beyond their tolerance, these fungi retreat or die. Without them, trees lose their invisible allies. Their roots absorb less, their stress increases, and their ability to support others diminishes. There's a feedback loop here. Stressed trees contribute less to the network, which weakens the fungi, which in turn support fewer trees. The forest becomes brittle, vulnerable, quiet in all the wrong ways. But it's not all grim. Forests are resilient, and so are the networks that support them if we give them the space and time to recover. One promising area of research is in forest restoration. Ecologists are beginning to understand that successful reforestation isn't just about planting trees. It's about restoring relationships. That means reintroducing native species, protecting mother trees, and even inoculating the soil with native mycorrhizal fungi to kickstart underground networks. Some restoration projects now begin with soil biology rather than saplings, building the web before the trees take root. In British Columbia, Simard and her colleagues have launched experiments where small groves of diverse, native trees are planted around surviving mother trees. The idea is to rebuild the network from its natural hubs, rather than starting from scratch. Early results are encouraging. The saplings grow faster, survive better, and show higher levels of carbon exchange when connected to a functioning fungal web. There's also growing public awareness. The idea that trees can talk, that they are part of a larger network, has captured imaginations around the world. Books, documentaries, and educational campaigns have helped shift the narrative. Forests are no longer just resources to be managed, they are systems to be respected. And sometimes respecting them means stepping back, letting forests regenerate naturally, allowing seeds to fall where they may, roots to find their way, and fungi to do their quiet work, often leads to better outcomes than intensive management. Nature has been building forests far longer than we have. With the right conditions, it will do so again. So what can we do? We can protect what remains: old growth forests, intact fungal networks, and the irreplaceable biodiversity of ancient woodlands. We can support reforestation that values complexity over speed. We can tread lightly in wild spaces, recognizing that every step may pass over a network centuries in the making. And most of all, we can remember that forests aren't just made of trees, they are made of relationships. Under every leaf, beneath every root, there is a story, a whisper, a thread in the living tapestry of the world. And though we may not speak the language of trees, we are part of their story too. So here we are, back beneath the trees, only now we know they're not just standing in silence. We've followed roots and whispers, watched nutrients flow from one trunk to another, and marvelled at fungal threads that stitch entire ecosystems together like nature's own internet. We've seen trees that nurture their young, send warnings through the wind, and share what they have through a network older than any city, older even than the idea of civilization itself. And though they don't speak in words, they do communicate. In the slow, deliberate language of chemistry and cooperation, shaped by millions of years of evolution. It's not intelligence in the way we usually define it, but perhaps it's something deeper. A quiet wisdom, a kind of collective memory. A forest that doesn't just survive, but remembers. Adapts. Reminds us that life, real life, is always more connected than it seems. Maybe tonight, or whenever you're listening, you're already starting to drift off, letting these gentle ideas settle into the quiet corners of your mind like leaves falling to the forest floor. Or maybe you're still wide awake, pondering how fungi negotiate trade deals, and wondering if that oak outside your window is part of some grand underground conversation. If so, well, I did try to keep this relaxing, but if you've stayed awake because it's too interesting, I suppose that's a risk I'll just have to live with. Before you slip fully into sleep, I'll gently ask again, if you enjoyed this little journey into the secret life of trees, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, or leaving a comment. It helps this calm little corner of the internet grow, like a sapling under a kindly mother tree. And just as we did at the beginning, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are right now? Are you tucked into bed at the end of a long day, or perhaps starting your morning slowly, one yawn at a time? Wherever you are, and wherever you're listening, I hope this helped bring a little wonder to your world. Because while forests are full of science, they're also full of stories, and now one of them is yours. Sleep well, fellow traveller. The trees are whispering, and you're always welcome beneath their leaves.